April 27th, 2011. A tornado so violent it erased entire towns, ripping a 132-mile scar across Alabama. But as Hackleburg fell, an invisible nightmare began. The storm severed power to Brown's Ferry nuclear plant, triggering the same type of emergency that caused Fukushima barely a month earlier. For 7 minutes, America faced the specter of nuclear disaster on its own soil. How close did we come to catastrophe? This is the story of the tornado that almost caused a nuclear fallout. Hackleberg. Warnings had blanketed Alabama for days, but by the morning of April 27, 2011, the language from meteorologists took on a sharper edge. The National Weather Service called it a high risk, the rarest and most severe alert in their arsenal. Forecasters described the atmosphere as a powder keg, primed for explosion. Temperatures climbed into the 70s, humidity clung to every surface, and a roaring jet stream high above funneled energy straight over the Tennessee Valley. Across the Southeast, emergency managers reviewed tornado plans, and schools debated whether to open at all. In newsrooms and on weather radios, the numbers began to sound unreal. Over 3 days, more than 360 tornadoes would touch down from Mississippi to Virginia. Alabama braced for the worst, but the true scale of the outbreak would only become clear as the hours unfolded. By midday, the sky over northern Alabama had turned a bruised, sickly green. Storm spotters reported rotating supercells forming west of the state line, each one a potential killer. The Storm Prediction Center's severe weather outlook warned of strong, long-track tornadoes, the kind that can flatten entire neighborhoods and erase towns from the map. The super outbreak of 2011 was already rewriting the record books. In less than 24 hours, multiple EF4 and EF5 tornadoes would leave scars hundreds of miles long. For Alabama, the threat was especially dire. The state's geography, rolling hills, wide river valleys, and dense populations meant that tornadoes could form quickly and strike with little warning. Communities from Tuscaloosa to Huntsville prepared for impact. Hospitals readied emergency rooms. Power companies set up crisis centers, and utility workers were placed on standby. Even the operators at Browns Ferry nuclear power plant, some 50 miles north of Birmingham, reviewed their emergency procedures. Across the region, a sense of foreboding settled in. The ingredients for disaster were all in place. By early afternoon, the first tornadoes were already on the ground. Each new warning sent families scrambling for shelter, while storm chasers and news crews broadcast images of swirling clouds and debris-filled skies. But the day's most violent storm was still gathering strength to the west. Soon, a supercell would drop a tornado that would travel 132 miles, carving a path of destruction through Hackleburg, Phil Campbell, and beyond, setting in motion a crisis no one had fully imagined. At 3 p.m., deep in Marion County, Alabama, a rotating updraft touched the ground and became something far more dangerous than a passing storm. Meteorologists tracked the signature on radar, a tight, violent swirl, tightening as it moved northeast. Within minutes, the first reports came in. A tornado had formed west of Hamilton. But this was no ordinary funnel. The atmospheric ingredients that had been building all day, moisture, heat, wind shear, now combined in a single, monstrous cell. As the supercell surged forward, its rotation intensified, drawing in energy from the unstable air mass. The tornado grew wider and stronger with every mile, quickly reaching EF5 status. Winds inside the vortex would ultimately be measured at 210 miles per hour. This was a tornado capable of erasing entire towns, not just damaging them. Its path was relentless, stretching from Marion County through Franklin, Lawrence, Morgan, Limestone, and Madison counties, before finally crossing into southern Tennessee. The National Weather Service would later confirm the full track: 132 miles of continuous destruction, making it one of the longest and most violent tornadoes ever recorded in the United States. Communities in its projected path had only minutes to react. Sirens blared in Hackleburg, Phil Campbell, and dozens of rural crossroads. For storm chasers and emergency managers, the radar image was unmistakable: a debris ball, large and dense, signaling catastrophic impact at ground level. The tornado's width expanded to more than a mile, swallowing forests, fields, and everything in its way. The storm's forward speed gave little warning. Residents who had heard the sirens scrambled for shelter. Some families crowded into storm cellars. Others huddled in interior closets, hoping their houses would hold. The power of the tornado was not just in its winds, but in its endurance. Over the next 2 hours, it would maintain a nearly unbroken path, carving a scar across northern Alabama and into Tennessee. On radar, the supercell looked almost otherworldly, a hook echo wrapped in a curtain of debris, moving steadily northeast. For those in its path, the threat was no longer theoretical. This was the monster that forecasters had feared all morning, now unleashed on the ground. The 132-mile track would soon become a measure of both nature's fury and the vulnerability of everything in its way. The tornado reached Hackleburg with a force rarely measured on Earth. At its peak, the winds tore through at 210 miles per hour, enough to rip brick homes from their foundations and turn cars into airborne missiles. The funnel expanded to 1.2 miles wide, swallowing nearly everything in its path. In less than 10 minutes, 3/4 of the town was gone. Landmarks that had stood for generations: the high school, the Wrangler jeans plant, churches, entire neighborhoods, were flattened to bare slabs. Trees were stripped of bark and limbs, snapped like matchsticks, or ripped from the ground entirely. Pavement peeled from roads. Utility poles vanished. Hackleburg's main street was unrecognizable, reduced to a tangled mass of splintered wood, twisted metal, and shattered concrete. Houses disappeared so completely that only floor tiles and scattered personal belongings gave any hint of what once stood there. Emergency crews, searching the ruins, later found cars wrapped around trees and debris fields stretching for hundreds of yards. The tornado's violence left few places to hide. Some storm shelters were crushed or flung open, exposing families to the full brunt of the storm. The destruction extended beyond Hackleburg. Phil Campbell, a few miles northeast, suffered a similar fate. There, too, entire blocks were erased, and survivors crawled from collapsed homes into a landscape that looked as if a bomb had detonated. Across the 132-mile track, over 2,600 structures were damaged or destroyed. More than 1,000 homes were reduced to rubble. In some places, only the bare earth remained. The cost of the devastation would reach $1.6 billion, but the numbers could not capture the scale of loss. By the time the tornado finally moved on, Hackleberg was a town in name only. The physical world had been stripped away, leaving behind an emptiness broken only by the sound of sirens and the voices of those who survived. Jimmy and Linda White had lived in Hackleburg for decades. On April 27th, they took shelter in a narrow hallway closet, the kind of place that had always felt safe in storms before. As the tornado closed in, the sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, a deep, grinding roar punctuated by the crash of splintering wood and shattering glass. The walls trembled. The roof lifted away. When the noise finally stopped, the silence was almost as shocking as the storm itself. There was nothing left of our house when we stepped out. The tornado took everything, Jimmy said later, his voice flat from exhaustion. Around them, the neighborhood had vanished. Where homes and trees once stood, there was only a wasteland of debris. A neighbor's pickup truck rested upside down 2 lots away. Street signs were gone. Familiar streets were erased, replaced by tangled piles of wood, insulation, and the scattered remains of daily life. The tornado had struck with such force that even storm shelters were not always enough. Some families emerged from beneath collapsed walls. Others, less lucky, were found by rescue crews hours later. In Hackleberg and Phil Campbell, 71 people lost their lives that day. The number is easy to recite, but each was a person with a story, a family, a place in the community. Linda White remembered the faces at church, the regulars at the cafe, the children who played in the schoolyard. You think you know what a tornado can do, but you don't. Not until you see it with your own eyes, she said. Survivors wandered the ruins in a daze, calling out for loved ones, searching for anything familiar. The air was thick with the smell of splintered pine and gasoline. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, but cell phones were silent. Towers down, power lines snapped like twigs. The sense of isolation was total. For hours, it was impossible to know who had survived and who had not. In the days that followed, volunteers arrived from miles away, strangers bringing food, water, and blankets to the shell-shocked residents. But the loss was everywhere, impossible to measure in numbers alone. The destruction was not just physical. It tore through the fabric of the town, scattering memories and futures alike. Yet even as families mourned, the community began to reckon with what had happened. The visible ruin told only half the story. Unseen, beyond the edge of town, another crisis was unfolding, a silent threat that would test the limits of human resolve and the systems built to protect them. High above northern Alabama, the grid was unraveling. In less than an hour, the Hackleburg tornado and its trailing storms had ripped down more than 100 high-voltage towers. Transmission lines that fed power to the Browns Ferry nuclear power plant were twisted on the ground, snapped like thread. At 4:36 p.m., every external connection to the plant was lost. Inside the control room, alarms blared. The familiar hum of the outside grid vanished, replaced by a sudden, unnatural silence. Operators watched as indicators for all 3 500 kilovolt lines went dark. Then the 161 kilovolt lines followed, one after another. The plant was now isolated. No electricity coming in, no way to draw power from the outside world. This is what nuclear engineers call a station blackout. The term sounds clinical, but its meaning is anything but. Without outside power, the pumps that keep reactor cores cool can't run on their own. The same sequence of events had triggered the Fukushima disaster in Japan just 1 month before. There, the tsunami had drowned backup generators and batteries, and the loss of cooling led to a meltdown. Now, in Alabama, the tornado had delivered a different kind of knockout, a total loss of the grid, but the same invisible threat. As the last transmission line failed, Browns Ferry's reactors responded automatically. Control rods slammed down into the cores, halting the nuclear reaction in a process called a scram. But stopping the chain reaction was only the first step. Even after shutdown, the fuel rods continued to generate heat. Without cooling, temperatures would rise fast. Inside the control room, operators led by Mark McWhorter and Susan Joyner moved with rehearsed precision. Their training was clear. In a blackout, every second counts. The plant's emergency diesel generators had to start immediately. If they failed, the window to prevent disaster would close in minutes. The operators could not see the tornado's destruction, but they could feel the weight of it in every flashing warning light. The alarms, the loss of power, the knowledge of what had happened at Fukushima. These were the new realities. In that moment, Browns Ferry stood at the edge, caught between the violence of nature and the silent, relentless physics inside its own walls. Inside the Browns Ferry control room, the familiar background hum had vanished. In its place, a wall of alarms and blinking panels threw the room into a tense, unreal quiet. Mark McWhorter and Susan Joyner, both seasoned operators, worked side by side, eyes locked on the cascading loss of power indicators. The tornado's destruction had left the plant cut off, every outside line severed. In that instant, the only thing standing between the reactors and disaster were the plant's emergency diesel generators. The procedure was automatic, but the stakes were anything but routine. Within seconds of the blackout, the first generator roared to life. Then a second. Each unit's safety systems drew power as relays snapped over. But not all the news was good. Unit 3B's generator, scheduled for maintenance that week, was offline. That meant less redundancy, more pressure on the remaining machines. Every operator in the room knew the margin for error had just narrowed. Manual checks confirmed what the alarms already screamed. The grid was gone. McWhorter called out, "Confirm EDG sequence complete on Unit 1. Joyner's voice cut through the noise. "Shut down cooling lined up on Unit 2. On Unit 3, the missing generator forced the team to reroute loads and watch for signs of overload. The remaining diesels carried the burden. Their vibrations felt even through the concrete floor. 7 minutes passed before the entire station's emergency power status was fully confirmed. In those minutes, the operators worked with a focus sharpened by the memory of Fukushima, just 1 month in the past. It was like time stopped. We had seconds to get the backup running, McWhorter later recalled. The generators did not falter. Cooling water kept circulating. Fuel rods stayed covered, and the threat of meltdown never crossed from possibility to reality. When the final checks were complete, a wave of relief swept through the control room. The worst had been avoided. not by luck, but by the relentless discipline and training of the operators, and by machines that started when they were needed most. For a moment, the invisible crisis had been held at bay. But outside, the damage that started it all was still unfolding, and the plant would run on emergency power through the long, uncertain night. On April 27, 2011, the Hackleberg Phil Campbell EF5 tornado carved a 132-mile path, destroying 3/4 of Hackleberg and leaving 71 dead. That same tornado severed all power to the Browns Ferry nuclear power plant, forcing operators into a station blackout. The same sequence that triggered Fukushima just 1 month earlier. For 7 tense minutes, Browns Ferry relied on emergency diesel generators to prevent disaster. According to NRC records, the plant's automatic safety systems worked as designed. Yet some internal reports about real-time decision-making and exact generator status remain redacted. Today, the National Weather Service and Nuclear Regulatory Commission both cite this event as a case study in compounding risks to critical infrastructure. The Hackleburg tornado stands as rare proof that natural and technological disasters can intersect within minutes. The documents and images from that day are a reminder. Even the most advanced systems are never invulnerable when nature's violence and human technology collide.